of even a fully fledged supranational multi-level democracy, I think there are flaws, democratic flaws. And I'm saying this because that's a normative position that I take, and I think Anja would have a lot to comment on that, maybe, or maybe not. But the discussions that we have revolve around this. So just to say that there are other positions. So there are people that are saying, no, it's fine, we don't need more Europe, we need less Europe. But anyway, so that's sort of my normative point of departure. And the second, what follows from that is that democratization regards, I think, was that my computer?
Possibly.
So I need to. Okay, now it shouldn't be happening again. Oh, come on. Okay, so democratization can regard institutions. I'm not going to talk about this. It can be regarding processes and procedures, joint election lists, and all that kind of things. I'm not going to talk about this. It regards citizens' activity. I'm going to talk a little about this. And I'm mainly going to talk demos building, EU identity formation. That is something it's a very German idea, I admit. So it originated in the German debate, but the idea is, and that is very close to what we do in the CO3 project, that the EU needs a democratic subject that defines itself as such to a minimum extent, and that it identifies itself with the EU polity, and that is politically active with regard to the EU polity. So that means it's not just enough to say you are EU citizens and that's it, but that there should be some democratic activity. Democracy needs to be carried by citizens. And for citizens, in order to carry democracy, they need to have at least a vague idea of, oh, it's the EU that sort of we are referring to. And that means that there is a top-down way to democratize the EU and there's a bottom-up way. And this bottom-up way of demos building requires European identities. That's again, I'm very brief in here. We're happy to discuss this, but that's again sort of it's a theoretical assumption, normative theoretical assumption that I make. Okay, then what is European identity? And that is not easy because identities, collective identities, Benedict Anderson, we discussed him this morning, are socially constructed. They are changeable. They are not necessarily geographically fixed. They are marked by complex arrangements of belonging. They have an individual component and a collective component. That's very important for the analysis I'm coming to. This is very important because many people tend to equate European identity with national identity. And this is not what we are after, and we cannot be after this, because then you have these either-or identities. So are you French or German? Are you Finnish or German? And that is not what can be at stake. So we are searching after something different. But still, those conditions will be valid for the construction of European identity as well. Very briefly, a number of people have studied European identity formation. The bulk of these studies is quantitative. So we probably can still say that the majority of EU citizens, with a tendency that has been going down, supports EU integration and the European Union and membership in the European Union. Those are usually the items that are asked for. And about 50%, and again, some changes, have an unspecific positive identification with the EU in the sense of I feel European. There have been changes, but that also means that the other about 50% would not agree with it. There are differences, importantly, as according to nationality, the socio-economic context, and the level of education. I take Greece as an example. The Greeks used to be the most Europhile part of the European population before the financial crisis. After the financial crisis, the Greeks have the red lantern of the most Eurosceptic population in the European Union. Guess what happened in between? Yeah, so policy output directly influences that. Now, the puzzle is that EU citizens do not know much about the EU. So the question is, what do they identify with?
I just asked, from what time is it the first question when you said 50% identify with the EU?
That is, I haven't been exact. It's about up to 2005.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Sorry. And the basis is, today, I think from the last Eurobarometer data I followed, it's about the same today.
Okay.
But for this book, so I have been unspecific. Obviously, I looked at what the opinion polls said until 2005 to understand what happened prior to 2005. Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's a quantity question, but a good one. Okay, and then, so what I was interested in was more the other thing. It was the patterns of meaning. So something like a narrative, the contents of what people identify with. What do people identify with when they identify with the European Union? What does Europe stand for? And here, it's fair to assume, based on the findings of constructivist research on nationalism, that European identity is constructed in discourse. So several findings, empirical analysis also on how European identity is constructed. It's like national identity constructed in discourse, uses definition of us and them. It uses founding myth. So peace, for instance, is a very important founding myth. The discourses on European identity formation relate national and European identities. We have political allies having a central role. We have national allied discourses. I will be talking about that. They are very different in different member states. And we have also more critical EU constructions. So the meanings of Europe, of EU Europe, so the meanings that are circulated in EU identity construction processes are controversial. They are not the same. So different people would be associating different things with what the European Union stands for. We've been discussing this morning a lot about concepts and how they are contested, etc. So if you think a little bit about the debates on Europe that you have in your country, you will see that Europe also is kind of an empty signifier. So you can sort of associate with Europe sort of more or less what you want. Okay, so my question was, can national European discourses serve as a means for constructing EU identity and hence democratize the EU? And I have a discourse analytical part in the book. How do national European discourses of allies construct Europe and the EU via the quality press? Importantly, I did not just do a content analysis, but a discourse analysis. I will come to that. And then, how are these discourses shaped and influenced by the specific national context? I did a context analysis, and again, this is not typical for a discourse analysis. So in the end, I usually call that a discourse analysis, but for the methods cracks, I'm not really sure if it's like really a discourse analysis in the end, because I think it's more kind of a study that has not really a name. It's a comparative and mainly qualitative study, and the aim was to build theses and theories based on the findings. So a few words on discourse analysis. When I started this research, one of my supervisors said, okay, so you are doing a discourse analysis. Okay, so you write one chapter where you resume the state of the art of what is discourse analysis. So I set out and I read about the state of the art of what is discourse analysis, and then I said, okay. So first of all, it's kind of more of a theory and a methodology. It's a view. It's so when you say something, you are doing something. And discourse analysis is about how meaning is constructed. It refers to settings of specific and interrelated events or practices that construct meaning. It's about social actors that negotiate symbolic orders. And discourses are structured as according to certain rules. So here is sort of the methodological assumptions on what is a discourse. But after this, I discovered, after sort of 1 meter of books on discourse analysis, that there's no agreement. There's no discourse analytical method. You can just, and it's even worse, there's no method. Usually they won't tell you what they did. So there is something unsaid in the method of discourse analysis. So I sort of built my research design myself quite much. Then I made one assumption that is not typical for discourse analysis, that discourse are marked by their context. That means that in the German version of the book, and it's not in the English version, I did like a systematic analysis of the context. Because you really can only understand what happened in those discourses when you see the political context behind. So I was selecting these 2 cases because they are similar with regard to their role in the EU, but the national contexts were decisively different. You could say that the findings, in a way, confirm what was to be expected after these assumptions, and that might be, but I think it's still very telling. So I did a nice, intense analysis of huge discourses. Altogether, I coded more than 2,000 articles. I did, again, some words on method and inductive coding. So this is also why it's not a classical qualitative text analysis. I came with a set of assumptions about what would be the codes and what would be the motives. For the French people in this room, I was working in France then. I was a postdoc, a visiting postdoc at Sciences Po, and I had been discussing with French colleagues. And French colleagues told me, mais tu vas trouver le plombier polonais. Ça va être ça qui a décidé le débat. Okay, so I put le plombier polonais in my preliminary code system, and I went searching for the Polish plumber. Only I didn't find the Polish plumber. Nowhere. The press articles were not talking about the Polish plumber, even if my French colleagues, very decent researchers, were sure that the Polish plumber decided the French discourse. No, it was not in the sources. So now here comes a quote from Reinhard Koselleck, who is a very famous historian, conceptual historian, who said that the sources always have a veto power. So it's very important when you have set assumptions on what you will find that you are ready to just throw them down. So the Polish plumber is the most prominent, but I had a couple of other experiences with my preset codes. So after 4 weeks, I sort of frustrated, say, okay, forget about it. I'm just going to read my things, I'm going to work with my things, and I'm going to build my codes on the patterns that I find in the text, which is, by the way, something that since this experience, I tell all my students to proceed like this. Something that is different from many other stories is studies in the field is that I took the decision, and that was very important, and this I really owe to my French colleagues, that I needed to look at a broad range in the political spectrum. That was especially decisive for the French debate, because the French debate was decided from the left. So the dynamics of the discourse were decided from the left. So l'humanité was the first one. You have the decisive French motive, and it only appeared very late in Le Figaro. And if I had limited myself to Le Monde or Le Figaro, which would be the classical case of doing such a frame analysis study in EU studies, classically you would just choose one newspaper. So you would choose Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung and Le Figaro, or you would choose Süddeutsche and Le Monde and say, now I know the German opinion. No way, you don't know the German opinion. You know the expressed, printed opinion of a part of the German Allied, obviously. Now, this is again still Allied, but at least the political spectrum is broad, and that was really one of the most important decisions. Yeah, very briefly, as I said, I spent a lot of time thinking about how to do discourse analysis, and those were my 8 dimensions of research that I was after. I'm going to be quick on that and jump to the conclusions soon. I'm not going to be as quick on that one, because this is really important. I was after what happens in the discourse, how is meaning constructed, and why is meaning constructed in a certain way. So these are 3 typical questions, and that's a difference in classical qualitative content analysis, because they would only or mainly look at the question, what is in the discourse. And to me, it was really important that this was only the first step. And then sort of the really interesting questions are the 2 other ones. And especially for the third one, why is meaning constructed in a certain way and which rules are shaping the discourse? You need to know about the context, because otherwise you will never understand why somebody says something. One example for me, it was at first just reading the utterances. Very difficult to understand how the French politicians acted in such a different way from the German politicians. Someone like Laurent Fabius said, I'm going to campaign against the treaty. It's impossible in Germany. He would have been thrown out of the party. So in order to understand that, you need to understand that it's a part of a specific dynamic of the French political system and the French political culture to do that. So obviously the French discourse had different rules than the German one. That to me was a very interesting finding, but again, only understandable when you know about the context. Yeah, so this is what I did for the context, very long context chapters in the German version. I'm happy to send them to anyone who's interested. Now, the findings, the most interesting part. In Germany, we have a classical example of a press discourse. So EU and national politicians appearing, as well as journalists and experts. In France, we had those 2, but a strong bottom-up component. Citizens, NGOs, activists, trade union representatives were key actors and drivers of the discourse. And really the most interesting finding was this nom de gauche movement, which is really close, I think, to this Front Populaire, Nouveau Front Populaire. And it was a decisive politicization process. So it was discussed as the most decisive politicization of the EU that ever took place in France. And this bottom-up tendency was very decisive in the French discourse, and I think also in the referendum. There were different rules and levels of reference in both discourses. In France, we were discussing this over lunch, everything can be said. There's a traditional left-right divide, so that's kind of a rule. So you can say everything, but you need to sort of say first which camp you relate to. That's not really the case in Germany. And there was a new divide between the yes and no camp, which was roughly the divide between left and right, but not exactly, because the left was split in the question. So you could say whatever you want, but most of the utterances had a twist, saying that I say whatever I want because I'm for the yes or because I'm for the no. So then in the end, you can say what you want, but it has to be a contribution to a yes or no debate. In Germany, the debate was really very, very boring. There barely was a debate. So that's the main finding. And there is something that I discovered, I must say, with disgust, that it's the silencing strategy. So that's the way how any critical argument about the constitutional treaty was silent in the German discourse. In France, there was a very interesting contradiction and a very clear contradiction of us and them. So France was us, and the EU and the member states was the other. It was always about la France dans l'Union européenne. So the European Union was not part of the French us. Whereas in Germany, it was part of the German us. So Europe was us, obviously. So we drive Europe. So we have a mission in Europe, and we are a smaller part of Europe, who is sort of above us. And that's super interesting. The French discourse had a leading role for the German discourse. The Germans debated for a large part because they wanted to know what the French were discussing. Both discourses were related. Yeah, well, you didn't have a discourse in Germany, so you really had a lot of those press articles saying, what happens in France? So why the hell are they debating this treaty? And I'm going to switch to this, because I think it tells you a lot about what I have just been saying. So the pink one is the German discourse, and the dark blue one is the French discourse. So you see that there was way more articles. It's a number of printed articles in the French discourse. And you see that the peak, so the explanations are in German language, I'm going to translate this. The peak of both discourses was the French referendum. It was not the ratification vote of the German Bundesrat or the German Bundestag, it's those little peaks. But the French referendum was the thing that sent shockwaves through Europe and through Germany. You see that it was way more articles published in these days, more than double of what was published when the German Bundestag ratified the ratification law. So the French debate had a major impact in Germany, and the French no had a major impact in Germany. The discourse contexts, I really have to be short on this, but I try to say the essential things, were contributing to this. So in France, services publics are very important for the French understanding of what is la République. And the services publics were connotated as being extremely in danger because of European integration. So there was a big mobilization. There was also a mobilization around European integration as a cleavage. It was a big conflict. It's central. I think it still is today. It was successfully mobilized in the discourse that citizens can be very critical of the European Union, that the French idea of national identity can be quite much in opposition to European integration, and there have been many conflicts about European integration in France. So all this was sort of activated in the French discourse. Whereas in Germany, until then, there were barely any protest parties against European integration. There was barely any criticism about any changes in the German political system because of European integration. German national identity is built on the fact that Germany is a part of an integrating Europe. previous EU discourses are very harmonious, largely. It's only the citizens. So the German citizens in 2005 were slightly more EU critical than the French citizens, but well, no one asked the German citizens, so they didn't play a role in the discourse. So it went in a very much like in a permissive consensus or silent acceptance, what happened in Germany. Yeah, that's an overview of how the discourse went in France. And the decisive distinction in France was this distinction between the motives that spoke for a yes and those that spoke for a no. And there was a decisive difference also in the character of those motives. The opponents had rather, let's say, a populist means of presenting their argument. So they were really critical of the Allies, and they were really critical of the treaty. But as I said, they increasingly set the tone of the discourse. Whereas, interestingly, the yes motives, and that was something that happened in the Brexit debate later, were very abstract. On est pour cette traité parce qu'il n'y a pas d'alternative. That's not an argument. Yeah, it's empty. It was responsibility, pragmatism. It was France's interests are represented by this treaty, but you could see that the defenders were really at pains for finding arguments in order to defend the treaty. This is the motive that decided the discourse. I termed it the anti-liberal motive. Anti-liberal in the sense of anti-neoliberal, in France it's called ultralibéralisme, so an anti-economic liberalism. And I'm not going to read all this, just to say that very successfully the left and centralists at first, not only the Trotskyists, but also the socialists, Fabius, the trade union, they coined a motive of this treaty threatening the achievements of the French welfare state, service public, la République, sort of everything. And the French, and that might sound familiar, so I have been closely following French politics ever since this constitutional treaty debate, and I see many of those motives coming up. And also in the last elections, I saw many of these motives coming up. So in the book, there is a section on the 2022 presidential election in France. I think many of this is still valid today. So the criticism of allies was very important. The fear of the social situation played a lot, and a certain sort of EU criticism, and all this was sort of successfully merged. And you could really see in the discourse, and in the German version of the study, there are a lot of quotes that even the center-right politicians couldn't escape this argument anymore. Even Chirac, when he made TV experiences, he had to refer to this motive. And then you are sort of on the losing side when you say, yes, okay, bon, j'admets que l'Europe est ultralibérale, mais you are lost. Yeah? 54% no, 46% yes was the outcomes. And the main reasons for the decision was that the constitutional treaty was negative for the employment situation, the economic situation in France was too bad, and the constitutional treaty was too neoliberal. So I think that's a flagrant. It's rare that you find so flagrant arguments. But this finding really matches the finding of the discourse analysis very much. But also it says that the abstract yes motives were rather successful. So 39% said, I voted yes because the constitutional treaty is necessary for European integration. So what's that? That's an empty argument, in a way. In Germany, it was very different. There was a lot of imported discourse, as I said, and there was the one thing that I originally had been looking for, that missed in most of the discourse. What kind of Europe do we want? What do the EU citizens do? Where does the EU identity come from? So basically, we could also say no one debated this except the Germans after the French No vote. No one else discussed this otherwise. And there was some small Germany-related discussion, but it wasn't very important. It appeared here and there. And the main thing in the German discourse was a rule, which I termed silencing strategy. And that meant that the EU critics in the big parties and in the PDS, so the PDS is the predecessor of what is today's left party and today's, oh my God, Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht. So what would that be? Bündnis, what is a Bündnis in English? Alliance Sarah Wagenknecht. So, anyway, so it used to be this successor of the Eastern German Socialist Unitary Party. And they were sort of more or less outspokenly against the treaty, but in the big parties, only very marginal voices spoke up against the constitutional treaty. And you could really see how they were marginalized in the discourse. So either criticism wasn't taken up. It says here 3 lines. So the German Constitutional Court stopped ratification of the constitutional treaty after the French no. And there was such an article, a headline in Le Figaro on the first page. In Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, it was that, really on the margins of the first page. And it wasn't even worth a discussion. Then there is a notorious EU critic in Germany. He still is active, but he's no longer in the parliament, Peter Gauweiler. And when Peter Gauweiler said something, the Christian Democracies Party said, oh yeah, Gauweiler, okay. Don't take him seriously. He doesn't count. And the last step was to say, okay, if you really vote against this, then we will have to think about this when we do the next candidate lists. So it was really, I saw this in several times at work. Every party used the same strategy. No one, so you had a lot to lose when you were issuing any EU criticism. And the EU criticism even could be moderate. You weren't even sort of allowed to say, maybe I don't like this treaty, or maybe this treaty could be improved. We can talk in the discussion about why I think that is the case in Germany, but I found it like really, really telling. So in comparison, you have a very open German discourse, continual references to the EU and France as us. So a lot of European identity in this respect. Unfortunately, until May, you barely had a discourse because the Germans only debated because the French discussed. So that was not really sort of my most optimistic finding here. Whereas the French had a very intensive discourse. They had a strong mobilization. They were discussing the EU like really fervently. Unfortunately, in the end, they constructed France as us, as the EU as them, so an opposition between the EU and France. If you think of my criteria of multi-level identity, this is not what we wanted. We wanted France as part of the EU and not France as opposed to the EU. So a strong closeness and self-relatedness in France. We looked at that. And in conclusion, and hey, I'm meeting the time about, national contexts influence EU discourses massively. We had in France a broader intensive discourse, but a construction of an opposition between the EU as a polity and France. Now, the important thing for my question after European identity is that this constructs non-identification. You can be very critical of the EU and still say, I'm a convinced European. I would be critical of EU migration policy, but always say I'm a convinced European. So I would identify as a European. I would identify as a German, obviously. I'm pretty happy with our constitution, for instance. That doesn't mean I will like everything our new chancellor does. So there is a difference between policy criticism and polity rejection, and that's very important. Very important to take into account. Whereas in Germany, you have all this identification, but you don't have democratic activity because there was barely any democratic activity in the sense of a discourse. So unfortunately, that means that my 2 discourses, in my view, don't really work so much as a means of demos building and EU democratization for different reasons, except maybe for the German discourse after late May, because then suddenly you had like an open discourse about what do we want this European Union to be. We could also have a more positive reading and say that there are chances and limits, a classic of European identity formation. So we saw in France an EU-related democratic activity of the citizens. So that's good. That's what I wanted. And if this had constructed something like a positive identification to the EU polity, together with a constructive criticism, saying the EU is my project, but not that kind of Europe, that would have been like a positive result. Whereas in Germany, there is this clear and positive EU relation, but the interesting thing is whether citizens would sort of join in these activities. I think there's one last thing. So we can then say, and that's sort of counterintuitive, that nevertheless both discourses have EU democratization. Because the German triggered construction of an EU open identification and the French triggered bottom-up activity. Oh yes, to be a means of demonstrating national EU discourses should do both, but nevertheless they, help democratize the EU. And thinking about it a little bit in distance, I would probably say it's still kind of a demos construction, but in terms of a critical demos construction without this identification. So maybe at the outset, my sort of thesis of identity construction, like right away, was maybe a little bit too strong. This is sort of what I think now after the study. Yeah, so that means that the discursive construction of EU identity is complex and linked to a number of conditions, and there's no simple cause-effect model at work. We need a number of factors that need to play together constructively. Since but I think that's the last slide. So you need to have patterns of meaning that are constructed and circulated at all. Remember, it wasn't the case in Germany so much. So open up a discursive arena. And then, as in France, you can Europeanize national public spheres via national interests or via a European opening. I don't think that the difference is so decisive here. It can be both ways. So in case then you have a discursive arena and you have meanings for the EU that are circulated, then this other condition comes in. Generally supportive identification with the EU as a polity. Again, it's not negative for democratization if this doesn't happen. It's only that it probably will not construct European identity, not in those positive identificatory terms. That also means that democratization is not the same as identity formation. And that also means that, unfortunately, if you ask the citizens, you might get an opinion that doesn't conform to what EU allies expect them to do, because they tend to think for themselves. Anyway, so I came up with this: an intense discourse on the EU and its policies is very positive, and it's a kind of construction in any case. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent. Thank you, Claudia. Who wants to go first?
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. So if you wanna just
should I stop
return there?
Maybe.
Yeah. You can stop and maybe come here because the camera is filming.
Okay.
Here. Yes, you are in the picture.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for firstly to allow me to read this book and to attend this presentation. I learned a lot. I actually have quite a lot to say, and I'm not sure if I'm able to say it all in one go. So I might do it in multiple rounds throughout the discussion. So first thing I would like to say is that I will really use this book with my students, in the sense that back at home at my university, I teach to master students interested in multi-level governance in Europe. And in the end, there is the technical side of it, how to govern, but there's the other half of it is what we're discussing here, this collective identity. And I actually see, and this to come back what was said at the beginning, the timeliness of this topic. I really see students really much engaged with this, and I think, and I agree very much with what William said about the political climate today. That solving this issue of the collective identity is really something that is very timely. It was great to hear in the presentation how the sort of the personal history behind this work. Because I shall admit that also when I first opened the book and I saw it was going to be about these campaigns of 2005, I had perhaps the reaction of the editors and the reviewers saying, okay. And when I learned, when I then read it and heard it now, I really got convinced. And this is also something I think a key lesson that I will take with me to repeat to students is that space and time are basically analytically are the same things. There are spaces within which cases happen from which we can learn. And this is what this book does very well. It takes these two events that took place in 2005 on a very important moment for European integration and identity construction. And these are these moments for which we can learn something. And the next thing I want to say is I very much like the question that you pose that sort of works as the umbrella for the study. So can these national discourses sort of contribute to the construction of a EU identity? And here I will open now another big box. So as an approach, also if I hear your history on how you started this work, it starts off as what you would call an interpretivist, social constructivist approach, the reconstruction of meaning. As you proceed, to me, it becomes also a bit more of a positivist approach in the sense, especially when you start talking about patterns by which this meaning is constructed. So when we talk about the patterns by which meaning is constructed, in the end, we are talking about an objective reality we can touch, which is then the positivist view of the social reality. And this is really what I think is emerging from this book, and it's really something fascinating, and I would encourage you to really build on this and go further on this, because I think this is really what EU policymakers need. They need concrete answers about what are the patterns by which the EU collective identity is constructed. And it's also therefore that the case selection is wonderful, because if there are national discourses that can construct EU identity, that there should be certainly those of these two countries that are really at the center of Europe. This then leads me to, let's say, a few doubts I have when listening to the conclusions. It is also because in the end, also in the book and also in the presentation, in the end, the answer to the question of can national discourses contribute to the formation of the EU, it disappears a little bit. Like we talk about a lot of things, but in the end, can these national discourses contribute to the construction of the EU identity? And I think the answer is somewhere there, but there might be one case missing to confirm the answer. Because you identify these differences between France and Germany. So we have in some way the construction of an EU identity that takes a certain shape in France and another shape in Germany. This is related to the discourse itself. I just wonder if it's really the discourse, or if it's simply due to the fact that we're speaking of a majoritarian system and a consensus democracy. Because in the end, France is, let's say, within continental Europe, is the most British system in a way, in terms of majoritarianism. And what you see here is very much this bipolar us versus them, which typifies majoritarian systems. And perhaps it's not even an accident that in France we had this result of the referendum, and in the other majoritarian system, UK, we had Brexit, because these electoral systems trigger a bit these dynamics. Whereas in a country like Germany, the consensus triggers more this what you described, this not really talking about issues, avoiding conflict, etc. But then that's what I mean. The third case that would sort of solve this riddle would be the Netherlands, because the Netherlands is just like Germany, but in the Netherlands also there we had a referendum being the same result as France in a way. So if you would study one more country, I would really look at the 2005. So I would stick to the 2005 year, but look at the Dutch campaign. And perhaps to conclude, two more things. One small thing in the end, what I also found interesting is that the way you described how in Germany the whole discourse on Europe evolved, it's the same way as I remember it when I was studying in 2008, 2009 in the Netherlands, and I had German professors, and I have the feeling that was a bit how in overall the EU, there was not really the willingness to problematize the EU, especially university elite ambiances. It was also the whole narrative, the EU is great, The Eurosceptics, if they're Eurosceptic, they should not sit in the European Parliament, they should sit in the national parliament, which is absurd because if you're Eurosceptic, you should exactly sit in the European Parliament because that's your opinion on Europe. Which brings me to my hopefully final point, which is I liked your reflection at the end, like when you were discussing, you feel German, sometimes you like what you dislike what the Chancellor does, but this still means you identify with Germany. And in the same way, we should think about this in terms of EU identity. We sometimes dislike the EU, but we might still identify with it. And this would mean that also the Eurosceptics, in a way, this whole wave of Euroscepticism means that there is growing people that identify with the EU, because I mean they are against some aspects of it, but in the end, when I hear Meloni talk, I think even Le Pen, and they talk about Europe. They want they want a different migration policy, etc. But they still talk about Europe. So there, in some way, perhaps it is a European identity that has been created thanks to the politicization processes that you talked about. That was it. So I said actually everything I wanted to.
Thank you very much. I think I think maybe go now, and then Claudia will respond, and then we'll open the floor.
Okay, great. So thank you for the super interesting presentation. And so the introduction that you gave got me actually already silent on my first comment, almost only. Because I mean, when I was reading the book, I was also thinking, okay, it's from 2005. But my argument is a little bit different than like a data-driven political scientist, but I would like to refer a little bit more to the content, right? Because I was wondering, in 2005, you were talking about politicization, right? And we see here that a little bit of politicization and a bit of this happened in France. In Germany, we see this happening less, but in any case, particularly in Germany, it was obviously nothing that really did get through to citizens and so on and so forth, right? So, and I found this quite interesting also to see a little bit deeper than into the different contexts, because I work more with Sven-Hutter, Hans-Peter Krise, and so on and so forth, and they use more quantitative data. So I think it's very, very enriching to have like a sharper point of view to what was happening and also to why this was happening. And later on, I will show you like a study that I did on European integration, or like where the question is more or less European integration, right? And where we see that there have been like very large representation gaps in the German parliament, but also in the French parliament, but also that the mainstream parties in France have been obviously a little bit more to the middle of the scale, like neutral, let's say, than it was the case in Germany. So I find that for this take already quite interesting and quite enriching what you're doing there, even if it's for 2005, because it really shows that even if it was an elite-driven process or was in a way labeled as being elite-driven, so at that time I was not following everything. So I was too young. So, but I guess it still holds, and it still has like some rather important implications for what we are also seeing nowadays. And also, so for me, what I was missing a little bit when talking about politicization and the way that it's usually conceptualized and usually applied, the salience of the issue, I guess that's something you could show a little bit more systematically, that politicization wasn't given in one case, probably yes, and the other one not so much. So to have this a little bit more systematic in the analysis, and also then when you wrap up your findings, right? Because there I was expecting a bit more, I have to say, right? Or was it more systematically, it was systemized here and there and there, and on that level and on that level and on that level, right? So this is the very first point that I was having. So, and for me, the idea and the link, maybe you can tell us a little bit more on that, because obviously we have been discussing the results of the discourse analysis, mainly the link that you saw or assumed also between politicization, democratization, and EU identity. So is this like clear path, or did you really assume a clear path in that? What did not hold? What did not hold? Is politicization a means for democratization because it's contested, implicitly you say that. What does it mean then for EU identity, particularly if we have these differences in those main countries, right? Yeah, and then also thinking in this three terms: politicization, sorry, democratization, and EU identity, right? The idea, like identity versus contestation, is something that came into my mind, right? Because obviously the idea, or would the idea mean we need contestation to be clear about where we want to go? Or is it maybe something we can just not solve on a European level or on a larger scale, right? So how can we then explore identity? Can we say it's the European identity of the French or the Germans or both, or is it more complicated, right? And can we then also talk about the construction of Europe or the EU identity when we have a look at concrete policies? Because some of the contextual factors that you have been having had also policy implications. How does this then lead to identity? Right? So this would be a nexus that I would be more interested in, because if we say we construct identity via policies, right, then we would have something rather reactive than constructive. Right, it's not coming like from the identity, and by this we have the different policies that we suggest, but we have the different policies and only react on it. Is this something how we can build an identity or not? Right, and this is something that I think we are also currently seeing when we end this concept now with more to nowadays setting, when we have a look at the different discourses about Europe and European defense. Because what Macron was bringing in the very first days when everything collapsed, let's say, bringing forward was that he was not reacting to what is happening elsewhere in the world. He was completely focusing on Europe. I mean, he already has his discourse since a couple of years, so it was easy for him. However, you know what I mean? So he was really focusing on Europe without a reaction on something. And this is something that I also think might be interesting to see when we talk about EU identity and democratization, like coming more from the inside, and is the inside then really bottom up, right? Yeah, so another thing was, I find it super interesting to see your approach about this construction, right? But I was then wondering, how would you react, or what would be your take on how the European Parliament is currently constructed, right? We have the European Parliament, we have different party groups from all the different, where parties from all the different countries give their representatives a seat, let's say, right? And they're still built together. Does this really mean that we can have that the European identity, if we want to say that there is one, can be built on that level? Can it be built? Can it really just be discussed or politicized on the European level the way that it is? Right? So, yeah. And do we then really can we really think of like an ideal way of a bottom-up process for identity building to proceed the way that we have the way everything is constitutionally also constructed, right? And then maybe last thing, I have some other things, but I guess I close with something a bit more like linking what you are doing to current research or what's going on currently. So what would be then your take for projects on the Conference for the Future of Europe? And I'm not sure how much you did follow that or know about it. Would you then see similar patterns when it comes to citizen discourses or not?
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary.
Can I just ask one more question? While you were talking, I didn't quite understand if in Germany, according to your findings, the collective identity, let's say the EU identity amongst people, is different than in France, given that the national discourses were so different.
Okay, thanks a lot. If you have your comments like in writing, because I would be happy to receive them. So thanks a lot. I'm tempted to start with Miriam's comments, if I may. And I try to share this again. Can you see this? No. Okay.
The system is not perfected.
Did you switch something off? Maybe?
Yes, wait. Yeah. Amazing.
Cool. Okay. So, politicization. I estimate my dear colleagues Sven Hutter and Hans-Peter Krisi very dearly, but I use a different definition of what is politicization, which is sort of what I quote now is from this book. And when I did the German version of the book, I did not study politicization. That was something that I sort of, I wouldn't say added into the framework because that wouldn't be justified, but I sort of looked at the data through the angle of politicization, because it occurred to me that this is a very fruitful angle that I didn't use like in the first instance.
Totally, yeah.
But that is to say that obviously sort of some unclarities that you sort of mentioned very well followed from that for that book, like not in general, but for the book.
Yeah.
It just occurred to me, if I ever do like an English language version of this book, then politicization needs to be in it, but it was just not possible to do like a systematic.
Of course.
So if I do the study with the Dutch as the third case and I collect additional data, I think it would be very interesting to do that. And I would not like immediately absolutely reject doing that, given like the typical character of the cases. What then is politicization?
Yeah.
Importantly, politicization is what Colin Hay termed a multi-level concept. No, I think it's Wood, not Matthew Wood. So there's a theoretical and a normative level of politicization that I have in this. And on the theoretical and normative level, interestingly, I just have an article that is now coming out on politicization and democratization.
Interesting, yeah.
And it's tricky. So I need to be a little bit longer of this. So let me jump to my definition of politicization, which is very different. So when Hans-Peter Krisi heard that, he said, oh my God, that's horrible. It really means to mark an issue as collectively relevant and as an object of politics, and hence as debatable and contested. So salience is not in there. That's why there's no salience analysis in the. Even I think with this data,
exactly, you could have.
I have a salience analysis. It's just that I don't read it because I think it's a. I would say that salience for me is not an indicator of politicization being there. Well, obviously it's an indicator of politicization being there, but it's an indicator of the intensity of how an issue is politicized, and it's also an indicator of which issue is politicized.
Yes.
So what the debate revolves around. This is sort of what I would make with the salience thing, but it's not central in this.
Yeah, I would just, frankly, just like push you, Frank, because with everything that you have, I guess you have something absolutely like valuable for the whole debate, even in this longer version of defining politicization.
Yeah, you're probably right. Yeah.
And it's there.
Yeah, the thing is that sort of I have been like really busy saying no. Politicization for me is not salience, because I think salience has a short. It doesn't catch the whole dynamics.
Yes, but they would also not say the same.
I know. Yeah. No, I really like this book, The Politicization. Yeah. I think it's a very solid. It has some things in common, because this book that they did. They also wanted to go behind some mainstream interpretations and views. Anyway, so that's the definition of politicization.
Okay.
And then on the theoretical and normative level, it can be good for democracy, and here's the same again, if it's democratic politicization. So there can be anti-democratic politicization. Politicization is not necessarily a pro-democratic activity. Look at what happens in the US. It's extremely politicized, and no one would say that it's pro-democratic in any way, except in Trump's definition of democracy.
What do you mean now?
In the US, the debates in the European Union, so in the US around everything, basically. Ports, judges,
Yeah.
abolition of DEI programs. So you have highly politicized debates,
Yes.
but you wouldn't say that, we could say it's political activity, it's politicization, it's sort of naming issues as contested, but it's going against representative and liberal democracy in what it does. It prepares democratic backsliding. This is what we see in the US.
Yeah.
So there is no causal link between politicization being always democratization. It can be anti-democratic politicization. In brief, the article, I really spent a lot of thought on that, and I'm not sure I sort of resolved the puzzle.
Okay.
And that sort of ends up, and that sort of I also have in this article in sort of four scenarios that it can take. It's still, so reviewers have opinions on those scenarios, and I don't pretend I have the solution to everything, but it's kind of a tentative to get into it like a little bit more systematically. So ideal types are ideal types, sort of I don't claim they are the explanation to everything. So that was
we need them in a way.
Yeah, well, we know so little, so we need sort of to go towards it somewhere. Okay, so I will stop this link sharing then. So okay, again, sorry. Yeah, and then sort of this is also something that I came to think about when I was writing this piece on politicization and democratization. That this relation to maybe I will write another article about the concepts in this democratization, identity construction, politicization, contestation, Euroscepticism. You could go on and on and on. And they are all sort of Hilfskonstruktionen in Germany to sort of catch something that is really very difficult to nail down. Yes. Something that we were discussing today, and that goes to this Germany collective identity thing, etc. In Germany, it has been very common to assume that being critical of the EU means being against the EU, means being anti-democratic, means being populist, and means being Eurosceptic, and means to be seen in normative terms, like in bad normative terms. Nothing of this is causal. Nothing of this is causal, and I think that's a weakness. It's also it's a decisive weakness in our categories of analyzing the European Union. As I said, you can be perfectly critical of a policy without, being Eurosceptic in the least. Many of the arguments of the French, so when you read them to the substance, were not against the European Union as a polity.
Yeah.
And in particular, this point about identity construction and politicization and democratization, I think in the book, myself, this was not, it's probably the outset for really thinking about this more.
Yes, exactly.
One thing that I have to say is also that the book, or the idea of the book and the analysis, is to look at the patterns of meaning that are associated to the EU. So I have to say, I didn't say it in the intro, but it's important. In order to see if people then really identify, you would have to do a quantitative survey, or you would have to do a time series while the discourse is going on to really see what this does to the citizens and whether their opinions really change. So in the book, there's a long methodological section about why I don't say anything or not that much about how citizens actually receive that. So my interest was really merely to see which patterns of meaning were constructed. And that sort of says it's complicated. All right. So I think that's most of the two comments. And then you ask at the end, is in Germany the collective identity different than in France? I would say yes, totally. So you really have to see, and I think this is decisive, and that speaks for the third case. That's in Germany, European integration was part of the reason of the state. So Germany originated as Western Germany, originated as part of the West, and it only got part sovereignty because it was part of an integrating Europe. So Germany has not been sovereign until 1990 in reunification. It was under occupation. You really need to see this. So for the German, it didn't mean a loss of sovereignty. It meant a gain of sovereignty. Whereas in France, European integration has always been a threat. There's this very interesting debate on the European political community in the 1950s. And the communists and the Gaullists were against the European political community, against a common European army. Oh, no way we ally with the Germans on having an army. No, never. La Grande Nation. It's the French Mission Civilisatrice. We are special. And it's very, very different when it comes to this. And just sort of a little remark, I have some element of this in the book because I developed a model in the book that I then applied to the Brexit discourse. And at least I can see that the patterns that I saw in both debates, and especially in the French debate, happened in the Brexit discourse as well. So I think there's sort of some comparability, and there are some indicators that those findings will probably have a validity, but it would really be interesting to sort of test them systematically. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. We open the floor to questions. I wanna invite especially the students in the room to ask questions, not feeling obliged to follow the conversation so far. So you don't need to follow necessarily the political science questions or what has been discussed or commented, but if you have questions related to this conversation, that is the referenda in 2005, what is happening with the EU identity, how it maybe relates to the conversation, a similar conversation in the US, or anything else that has to do with this construction of a supranational body that is still information, or maybe it actually in deterioration, it depends who you ask, especially given the Brexit question. So anything that you have that is related to this, I invite you to please listen. And then I have a couple of questions, but first, yes. I'll take, if you have questions, you can raise your hand. I'll make a list.
Comment on the question. I found it interesting, like when you mentioned how France has a them perspective when it comes to the EU compared to Germany. And it's interesting when you mentioned that, especially like when you speak with like certain French abroad, they said, oh, I am European, for example, rather than saying they're just French. So it's kind of interesting to hear that perspective. And yeah, it was a very interesting discussion.
Would you like to, or you can take a couple?
Yeah, take a couple. Yeah, that's fine.
I have another question. Throughout your talks and also earlier in your lecture today, we've discussed citizenship and like EU citizenship and EU identity as sort of being like of great value and like as it seemed as the ultimate goal. But I wanted to ask why, and like what power that might have in the EU or why we value it so much. What is your stance on that?
Nathaniel.
Yeah, actually, I have many questions. Well, first, the curiosity thing is like 2005, I think is very important and it can be justified as well because it sends shockwaves politically from 2005 to now. First thing would be like Mélenchon, for instance, he gained like national visibility in these debates and he himself recognized that it is from 2005 onwards that he had this specific situation within the Socialist Party before he made secession. But it's not only him, like it's also created a lot of little movements, for instance, like Asselineau also gained visibility in 2005, Étienne Chouard as well, and you had like a lot of, we say rouge brun in French, so like red brown movements that exist in English as well. Can you say that? Like alliance between like sovereign right people and as well like taking a bit of the anti-liberal theory. That also came from the 2005 debate. So in a way, it shaped the political discourse and reshaped a bit the political landscape in France, which is why it's also an important moment, just like was a curiosity. Then I had a question more on the theory, which were related to the claim between identity and democratization, because towards the end of your talk, you mentioned that the two may not go together, but I wonder exactly what were the possible connections because there seem to be at least three possibilities that you mentioned. Is first that the most straightforward would be like, okay, if we don't have identity at the European level, we can't have democracy at the European level. And that's a democratic deficit, no demos thesis that is often mentioned. And I think you do not exactly say that. You say we can have democracy at the European level without having identity. But then, does it mean that it's unstable through time? So it's still possible to have it formally, or that the democracy that is happening at the European level is insufficient and not meaningful because people are not able to situate themselves, citizens are not able to situate themselves at the European level, and they keep only the national interest in mind. So what exactly is it that you're saying between these different options for saying that there will be disconnection between the two? And second question was more between like politicization and democratization. So I really like the example that you give, the saying that we can have politicization without having democratization, because in anti-liberal movements, for instance, or authoritarian states, US, for instance, could be like one example of this process right now. And I wonder if there was not another possibility. I have more like the social choice framework in mind, but like where you have politicization of issues, and if you have politicization of issues at the European level or within national framework, but for the European level, the more you have politicization of these issues, the more it also undermines the possibility that there is a meaningful aggregation of these issues at the European level. So the more you give to the higher level, the less possibility you have to also to have meaningful aggregation for democracy at the European level too.
I'm not sure I understand that. So the more you have politicization at the EU level?
Yeah, the more issues are politicized at the European level, so the more you will give topics to be treated at the European level, the more you lower the possibility that there is a meaningful aggregation of views at the European level. So you may end up with like majority equals more losers and winners at the European level, and then it would undermine stability and identity formation through time as well. So just like another theoretical possibility.
An aggregation of what? Of contestation, or an
aggregation of just preferences for policies, values.
And that could undermine the EU.
Undermine in the long run, because you would have like majority equals with a winner and losers through time. You would have like a temporal majority over an issue in values. Other countries would, people of other countries would disagree in the long run. You would have like this type of phenomenon in the long run, and just everybody would be unhappy with the final situation.
Okay. Can I have a round of answers, please?
Go ahead.
Otherwise, I will not be able to follow. Okay. Let me start with your last point. Is there a possibility? What I noted is where you have politicization, and the more issues that are politicized at the EU level, the more you encourage a meaningful aggregation of preferences at the EU level, and that in the long run could undermine the EU, right?
Yes.
Yeah, of course. That's absolutely possible. And that's a little bit a model that has been very dominant in EU politicization research. And there is obviously some truth in it, because the people that sort of invented that model, they are not stupid. The contrary. No, but I'm not. This is not what I'm trying to say. What I would try to say in another article, I've tried to. I think it's in this book too. I've tried to also develop a typology of the relation between EU integration and politicization, because there is again not a necessary correlation. So when you read this very famous article by Lisbeth Hoge and Gary Marks from from permissive consensus to constraining dissensus, that has been really very influential in EU politicization research. They say that, okay, permissive consensus in the end was a good thing for European integration. Citizens didn't ask too many questions, and the allies could just do what they want. See, we got a good result, we got European integration. Now the European Union is politicized. Citizens start to contest European integration. Right-wing parties start to contest European integration. So here we go, we are at constraining dissensus. And that, in my view, is totally correct. It's a good description of what happens in many member states. I would just say that it is one of at least 4 possible scenarios of what could be happening. Another scenario could be something like a bottom-up mobilization scenario of pro-European voices. So I studied, for instance, the European federalist movements, who had a strongly normative, strongly empathetic version. For them, the European Union was a political utopia. They campaigned for it. So that's perfectly possible. Just imagine a pro-European Fridays for Future. That sort of could be going exactly in the other direction. And the more we talk today, the more I think that the puzzle that we are sort of waiting in the moment consists of these these many concepts that are at stake. So identity, politicization, democratization, contestation, anti-democratic, pro-democratic. I really think I need to sit down and try to sort of disentangle them. Yeah, and that's really sort of some thinking work that I have to do. But yes, you are right. So my only comment would be it's not the only possibility. And there's this very famous article by Philipp Schmitter, who already said, he sketched very tentatively the other dynamic and said that if there is sort of an increase of the audience, if there's more salience, if people start to debate the EU, there can be like more identification and there can be a broader public and sort of that in the end can mean that people identify more with the European Union. So there is various dynamics possible. Then, can we have a democracy without identity? And what does that mean for Europe and European identity? Well, this is why, so in this CO3 project, we are talking about social contracts. And I was tasked to do a part deliverable on the European Union social contract. And I think that goes also to your question. Why is it a good thing? Why we should aim for that at all? It's really interesting, but European studies is a discipline with a mission. So we are supposed to be pro-European. When I go and give talk, and I have this Jean Monnet project, so I had a Jean Monnet chair, now I direct the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence. So there are many pro-European NGOs in Germany, and when they invite me, they are always shocked that I don't say, hey, I'm representing the European Union. Basically, the European Union paid my salary, which is not true, but funds me some projects, which is true. So go, and the European Union is a great thing. And I don't do that. I discuss the democratic deficits of the European Union. And then the elderly men, and Anja, and I think you two know exactly what I talk about, they will be shocked. But why? But you're supposed to defend it. Yes, I'm defending the European Union, but that doesn't mean that I'm uncritical. So I think those days are over. So is it a good thing? Well, it's perfectly legitimate to say, no, I don't think it's a good thing. This is why I made this normative claim in the beginning. That is sort of my normative take. And you could say it's personal. I would say it's not only personal, but it's for good reason. So it's personal because I'm a convinced pro-European, but it's for good reason also because, unfortunately, we have the European Union. It's there. The bad news is that if we try to abolish it, things will only get worse. So I don't think Brexit helped the country, like really. Yeah. British universities really suffer because nobody wants to come anymore. No researchers want to come, no students want to come. There were some problems after Brexit. I'm not really sure anybody wants what happened. So it's not like we could snip a finger and the European Union would disappear. But stopping the European Union to exist would mean disintegration, and it might possibly mean that there's a war in Europe sooner or later, again. So I think there are not only like my personal reason to be supportive of European integration, but to say it wouldn't be a wise idea to sort of destruct Europe. And then if you go with this, there are very good reasons to say that if we have a Europe, it should be a democratic Europe. And then it needs to be more democratized more. There might be colleagues of mine that would be disagreeing and would be saying, how do you want to do that? And there are no EU parties and it doesn't work and blah, 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 blah. And one argument in this is, how do you want to make European democracy work when you don't have a democratic identity? Now, the democratic identity thing and the social contract thing. We can have a Schumpeterian European democracy, a narrow model of democracy. Schumpeter never asked after a democratic identity. So it's perfectly legitimate. You just have elections. It just reduces the meaning of the election. It just reduces the quality of democracy. There's this famous book by Benjamin Barber who talked about strong democracy. There's this famous book by Putnam about making democracy work. It's all about those bottom-up levels, about civil society, about the ties that bind us together. So European democracy without an identity is like European democracy without a social contract. It's very weak. And it's again something that I think about a lot in this CO3 project. Can democracy really work without something like an identity or a social contract? And I don't think it can. There's this another interesting book by Patrick Deneen, Why Liberalism Failed. Patrick Deneen is a conservative US thinker and a personal friend of J.D. Vance, and a very conservative Catholic. No, but his book is good because he has good arguments, because he says that liberalism basically destructs the ties that bind people together. And when you sort of construct yourself as an independent individual that never has any ties, when you are just a consumer, well, how do you want democracy to work? When you don't learn to sort of respect the other just because it's the other, or to respect the walk along the Seine as a kind of common, as a public good. It's not there for my individual pleasure. It's not like I pay an entry fee, €5. I pay a city tax because I'm a visitor here, but you know. So it's a common. We could say it's a Parisian common, it's a French common, maybe it's a European common, the site that we see there. And when I start to think maybe it's a European common, then sort of I start to say, okay, then I'm probably responsible. Then I don't throw my dirt there. Then I behave. I'm a social being in a way. And so I think, again, there's this very famous Böckenförde quote. I only can say that in German. But he said, der demokratische Verfassungsstaat lebt von Voraussetzungen, die er selber nicht schaffen kann. The more I think about this,
But maybe we should try to translate.
The more I think about this, the more I come to thinking that is probably true. And the quote in translation, I will go slower. It says, a democratic constitutional state is based on premises and on basis that he cannot create itself. That is sort of what we are after. And I think that is sort of the puzzle. And that is, I don't think it's nice for many liberals, and I don't think it's nice for people from the left. Because we are talking about all those, things that we sort of want to get rid of, like ties, like communities, like religion.
Great, Lily.
I had a few questions. First, building off of that, I was wondering what you thought about whether there's a world in which national identity and EU identity can coexist, or if one means the other. And building off of that, if assuming that democratization is built through this EU identity, but if it's built through bottom up, kind of what you were mentioning before about like citizen responsiveness, but it's sprouting from like a national identity and like a reaction towards policies rather than like a strong EU identity, but more so as like a reaction to these policies and like sprouting more so from like national identity. So kind of like how those work together in the democratization. And then also given all of these different empirical examples that we've spoken about and like the differences between like Germany and France and Greece and, the Netherlands, is this like very strong common identity achievable given these, path dependencies and historical differences?
Yeah, thank you very much, Claudia. That's super interesting. I mean, there's so much to think about, and it's really interesting to get back to 2005 and the question that actually that nobody really has raised, interestingly enough, is so what has changed? I mean, how do we compare what you've seen in 2005 to today? How do we compare what you've seen in 2005 to the whole cycle of discourses by Emmanuel Macron? And clearly an attempt to build a new French EU discourse, much more close to perhaps the German conservative Democrat discourse about the European Union, something about identity, something about Judeo-Christian identity. I don't know. I mean, that's not really what he says. He tries to make cultural arguments, and that leads me to Macron. And that leads me to a little bit of a methodological question or something that I have always questioned in this Crisi and Hutter book, and which perhaps you have an idea about that. It's, we always unfortunately study questions of EU identity, questions of even cleavage building. We study it by studying constitution building in the European Union, treaty change. But actually this is not.
It's only EU scholars.
No, that's what you talked about Hutter, yeah. I don't do that.
Okay.
And I think we cannot do that because actually the effects, you only see them much later.
Yeah.
And that leads me to the second question that you have already I mean, you triggered me on the normative part, and we have a discussion with Claudia about what normative means. I do not say that we do not need a democratization in the European Union, but I would still ask the question, what is the European Union? Because we're all the time talking about a state, and it is not a state. It's a sort of regime, policy-making regime, if you think of the book by Paul Magnette. So we have policy areas in which we have more or less federalization, and we have, and actually you show that very well, we have actually different national public spheres. So how do we deal with that? And then is that context? I mean, are they defined by their context, or are actually just the agents very different? And that would be my third question. Where are the, sorry, that's a provocative one. That's the French one. That's the French political sociology one. Where are the agents in your analysis? Because you have context, you have discourses, you have journals, but these journals actually what you've analyzed has been written by journalists. They have done the selection processes. So you cannot really say something about whatever Chirac has said. And so that would be interesting also with reference to your conceptualization of politicization. So what can we really draw from this about who drove these discourses? And there I want to be, for last time, good provocative. You said, all my French colleagues, actually, they said that was the Polish plumber, and I didn't find the Polish plumber. Perhaps you didn't find the Polish plumber. Sorry, that's super provocative, but because you used the wrong resource. I mean, you used the wrong sources to analyze politicization. Because perhaps the Polish plumber was everywhere, but not in the journals, because the journalists sort of silenced. Perhaps there was a silencing strategy in France. In the media, I don't know. It's just, how can we get there without doing interviews? And sorry, that's the classical French question. But yeah, and that was the last one. But I think
Another one, or you're answering?
No, I think I should be answering. Thanks a lot. You give me so many things to think about. I will start with this question on EU identity and strong EU identity, because I think it's. So the answer to your question is clearly yes. So there can be, in my view, a European identity that goes along with national identity. It will be different from national identity. I think also that you were asking this question about what is the takeaway for identity formation. And I think, yeah, I know I end upon the differentiation. I have those sort of 5 conclusions in the end. So I'm sorry, but that's sort of what was the outcome of what I did. So the answer was, national mediated discourses of EU allies can be a means of European identity construction under the condition that, and then you have the 5 theses. That would sort of be the answer. I forgot to mention that. And then obviously it needs to be a kind of multi-level identity. The thing then that means that those processes we are talking about are getting more complex, and more things can go, in a direction that doesn't conform to this ideal, in a sense. And I don't think, but that's my personal assumption, that we are after something like a very strong identity. So when I was first thinking about doing a mixed methods project with a colleague who is now a professor for quantitative political sociology since some years. He said, okay, let's ask the citizens, would you go to war for the European Union? And I said, are you kidding? Why should that was in 2006, 7, something like this. And I said, are you kidding? Why would you ask that? That's stupid. And then he said, yeah, but that's a classical question in the quantitative questionnaires on national identity. He said, yes, but precisely, that's not what we are after, in a way. So we are not looking for something like national identity. And then again, national identity, and that was really my takeaway from this constructivist research on nationalism. There is not national identity. There's this very famous quote by, I think it was not Anderson, it was not Hofstadter, it was the third guy who wrote this very intelligent book, who said that for every criterion, every seemingly objective criterion for defining a nation, you find something that contradicts it. So it's not language, it's not culture, not even for the nations. Yeah, you will have minority languages and minority cultures. When you look at the French history, I read in the French context chapter, I read and I worked a lot on French secondary history, literature on the history of the French Republic. There's this very famous book by Eugene Weber, Turning Peasants into Frenchmen. And he describes how they were created, they were fabricated. France had regional identities, they were abolished. The minority language of Brittany was like eliminated. It's cruel. Yeah. So there is no such thing as national identity. There are no given criteria, and that sort of makes me say that this idea of a strong identity is not even working in the nation states. What has changed in 2005? Well, this is sort of brings me to my introduction. Maybe not that much. I think in France, not so many things have changed. I think a side finding from this book is that there is a serious crisis of French national political culture. If you are not a fan of political polarization and extremes, and if you sort of want liberal democracy to survive. So the extremes have only been getting stronger in France, in my view, and the political center has sort of been going down until it was almost eliminated. So if you think about this in terms of stability of political systems, then I don't think the path that France has been going is a very nice one that you would be welcoming. So that has probably changed. But then I think that you are right, if that was what you wanted to say, that many of those motives keep reappearing. And that's no surprise, because when you want to think about the European Union, there is not like an endless choice of meanings that you can give to the European Union. What we see now today, and I'm surprised nobody mentioned that, but what is new is this war thing. It's this army thing. That is not something that, and the people talked about this in the 1950s, and they talk about this today. It has been put on the agenda. It has not been on the agenda for the 70 years in between, but now it's on the agenda in a way again, and that probably has changed. And then EU scholars always study identity by studying treaty change. Well, yes, okay, so I'm an EU scholar, so maybe that always counts. But I think in my case, it wasn't possible otherwise, because I wanted to study the patterns of meaning that were circulated and constructed in the discourse. So you need a discourse to take place in the first instance. And this is what you need the treaty change for. The treaty change was the thing that created the discourse. So it was not because of the treaty change, but it was because of the discourse. Okay, I admit about the treaty change. I have a long argument in the book that I will try to resume about the meaning of what I analyzed. Because as said in the beginning, I know I did not analyze the national discourse. I analyzed an allied slice of the discourse that was mediated via the journalists. I'm fully aware of that, and I explained that. And I admit that there's a chance that there has been a silencing in the French discourse as well, but I didn't know. Well, if I didn't know, I didn't know. And if I didn't research it, I cannot find out. And I admit that I find it more probable that the French journalists will have reported about what they most of the events in the French discourse. And the argument that speaks in favor is that there was a lot of activities bottom up. There was Etienne Chouard, what's his name? It was a French teacher who wrote something like a pamphlet on the constitutional treaty. He basically did some of those word pamphlets. Today he would upload it, and we would today say it went viral. So everybody quoted the guy, and the guy suddenly was a Greta Thunberg of the referendum debate, and he was a teacher.
Turned worse.
Yeah, so he turned what? He
turned very badly during the COVID crisis.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah, that might be. So people like this sometimes do, but he obviously was taken up by the journalists, and I don't think this was necessarily because Le Figaro journalists would have dreamed of interviewing his teacher in a way. So I found a lot of reports about protests, about demonstrations, about the motive. What I saw was not Le Figaro not talking about it, but Le Figaro talking about it when it couldn't be avoided anymore. That was something that it really speaks in favor of doing a long-term analysis with various journals. So the motives that were in L'Humanité already in January, you found them in Le Figaro in May. So unsurprisingly, Le Figaro was the latest to take these up, like grudgingly. Like, okay, really now everybody talks about it, so we cannot avoid it anymore. So that speaks in favor of, not of this being about a realist image of what happened in the discourse, but in the end, you are right, I ultimately don't know. There are also a number of parts about the agents in the discourse. And you are right in that, obviously, I can only see who is an agent by the way he or she appears in the mediated discourse. I admit that, but sort of with that limitation, I did look systematically at the agents in the discourse and at the dynamics and who interacted with whom, etc. That's again the advantage of such a fine-grained analysis. Yeah, and I leave it here. And Roman gets impatient a bit.
Not at all.
Okay.
Not at all.
I give very long answers, but they are really demanding.
Not at all. I'm not. I'm a last round of questions. Anna.
Yes. So my question, and then I will give an example of why I'm asking this as well. A third one. So I'm wondering if the way that you presented this might mean that there is from the beginning, there was such a fragmented European identity. So you have these two parallel understandings of the European identity that are given equal value from each side. So it was unclear to me whether, for example, in the German discourse, they just reported the French discourse, or did they have comments on it? Did they criticize it or agree or something along those lines? And the reason why I'm thinking whether it was so fragmented in the beginning that it's kind of fatalist for the future of the European identity is also because, so I'm Croatian, so I will talk about Croatia a little bit. We joined in 2013, for example, and my understanding of how the Croatian population regards EU and European identity is different than the two that you have mentioned, for example. So when there was a referendum on whether we should join or not before 2013, most people didn't care.
What country are you from?
Croatia.
Okay.
Yeah, most people did not care. We didn't, during the referendum, we didn't have even 50% of people that voted. And they were kind of just swept into it. So the politicians made the decision, we joined, and eventually it became, the way I understand it, is a resource of some sorts. So the EU as a resource to change our politics in a way where we couldn't before, or a resource of money at the end, just like a money bag. And I feel like even today, this has not changed much. So I'm wondering if this different understanding of Europe would be maybe bad for the development. And you answered this to some degree already in my understanding, saying that there's only a limited amount of things we can say about the EU, right? But yeah.
What is the difficulty in your view, if I may ask? I'm not sure I got this.
So if we acknowledge that all of these completely different understandings of Europe and all of these different European identities are equally important, then we'll never actually agree at the end, right? And so if the French decide to, we can maybe adopt the German understanding of the European identity, then if things change, maybe there will be an understanding. But for now, it seems like they were so different and they didn't really interact, the two discourses.
I want to follow up on this. If I want to say that I'm fundamentally, I have two questions, but fundamentally throughout reading the book, I was particularly fascinated by the relationship between these three characteristics: politicization, democratization, and EU identity. So I think that if you didn't mean this, but when I read the Lincoln, at the beginning, when you say that, when you quote Lincoln to explain what democratization is, this tripartite part of the people, for the people, of the people, by the people, for the people, may actually apply to these three. And it seems to me, implicitly or explicitly, that there is a hierarchy here. As you said now, politicization means some political activity and consciousness, but it could go the other way. If you add the level of democratization to this, it means that we are already discussing something, but it is not yet a supranational, supra-member state identity. And EU identity, in the best way possible, if you account for the democratic deficit, is sort of the culmination of these three. You need these layers, one on top of the other, of the people, by the people, for the people, to have a a stable and sustainable and optimistic EU identity. So here are my two questions. First, which is a different formulation of what I just said. I listened last week, I had a conversation in the conference with Miguel Maduro, who has a project on how the EU may save us. He says, for many years, we criticize the democratic deficit of the EU, but we should think about the EU structure, especially given the war, the Brexit, and other phenomena, how the EU mechanism, now more conscious of the individual, of protection of rights, can actually stop democratic backsliding in EU member states. And morbidly thinking about it, it seems to me that what happened to the EU is not that we now may use it to save it, but the way we understand democracy has completely changed. We used to think democracy includes some protection of rights, some liberal notions, but maybe this democratization actually is not much thicker than the politicization aspect. That is, we are now so afraid of falling into authoritarian regimes in Europe that we just want the EU to preserve some very thin idea of democracy. So what is this democratization? Is it thicker actually than politicization or not? And then the second question, and maybe following what Anna was saying, and Annie also, I want to bring God and the Catholic Church into the picture. Different countries or different people may have different views about God. We may think that God is merciful or evil, that God is democratic or authoritarian, that God loves us or hates us. There is a strong phenomenological aspect in this book, talking about the EU, but from actually probably asking, as you also say, what the French and the Germans think about it. I wonder to what extent it affects the EU identity aspect of it. Because the fact that we have political consciousness and political activity and even democratic institutions and discussions of the EU does not necessarily affect the EU identity of French and Germans. Because imagine a different treaty. If we all sign the Convention of the Rights of the Child, it doesn't make the convention, the CRC, necessarily more or less democratic. It tells us something about how we would like to interact with other countries. But does it say anything about the EU identity of it? So that is, we may think different things about the Catholic Church and the French and the Dutch, or no, who else is Catholic? And the Italians may have different ideas of the Catholic Church. But eventually, if the Catholic Church is a despotic regime, then what we think of it and what this is, how this organization functions is not necessarily. There is sort of acoustic separation, it seems to me, and it doesn't necessarily pierce this acoustic separation. So I wonder how you look at it.
At the Catholic Church in what respect?
Replace now this with the European Union.
Okay.
That is, the European Union may not care, and actually does not care, and the democratic deficit that you mentioned in the European Union is not really affected by what the French and the Germans think of it directly, or the Croatians. It affects. It tells us a lot about French politics and French democracy and French democratic backsliding. And the same for the German one, and the same for the Croatian one. But it doesn't necessarily affect the EU, as we can see, because the democratic deficit, Weiler or not, Dieter Grimm or not, it is not necessarily the same, unless you assume that these three actually have a hierarchy, in which we do hope or would like these discourses eventually to form more democratic European institutions. I don't know if it's clear.
Yeah.
Not, but
I will try. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Emma, please, last question, and then we have to answer, and we have to close.
Just a small question.
Please.
Like I had thought of it from the lecture, but I've forgotten it from now. Like with the direction of the EU, as you had mentioned, and I understand that this democracy is sort of potentially being redefined, but is there a potentiality, do you think, for more organizations like the EU to be up and coming? Like just the existence of the EU as a unity, as a polity? Do you think that that's something that could come across in other areas of the world?
Yeah, okay.
The same level of success.
I'll save this question for the end, I think. So I'll start with the question on the different identities. I'm just writing up the result of something like that is sort of partly a follow-up project. I was directing a Jean Monnet network where we did focus group discussions with master students in EU studies and social sciences in 6 EU countries, among them Croatia. And the idea was really to learn what they think about democracy in the EU and whether they see a gap between the EU allies and the EU citizens. And it's fascinating results that I cannot extend upon is going to be my next presentation here, maybe, I think. So the students raised those differences really very strongly in the EU formula that is unity in diversity. So the EU, since a long time, has said we don't have to be all the same, we have to be equals. And again, like in her question about national identity, it's logical that the EU will only work in that way. So I would say also that in systematic and conceptual terms, differences don't have to be a problem if they don't turn into oppositions. Look at the Federal Republic of Germany. It's a federal state. So there's a traditional opposition between Bavarians and Prussians that goes back a long way, which is sort of today a kind of friendly, even folkloristic kind of fire that you have sometimes. So the Bavarians will also always be very different. They are not called a federal state, but they are a free state. Nobody knows what this really means, but the Bavarians keep insisting on it, and we let them do that. And we like to go to Bavaria and drink Bavarian beer, and we say, yes, you have your traditions. All right, Munich is a very nice city, Hamburg is a very nice city. And no, but seriously, and it used to be German part states that at times were at war against each other. So it's really not as simple as that. So it really depends on what you do with these differences and whether they stop from creating divisions. The same goes for the fragmented public sphere. One of the most fascinating results that I didn't dwell on so much because I'm not really an EU public sphere scholar, but in terms of the EU public sphere, the results are very telling. Because the French had kind of a Europeanization of a national public sphere, because suddenly the whole of France talked about Europe. So this is some of the findings that speak in favor of, okay, it works. So one way is to have this Europeanization of the national public sphere. The Germans had something more interesting. They didn't have a Europeanization of the national public sphere at first, but then they had something like an imported Europeanization. You could see how the French discourse swapped into the German discourse. There was a wave, it's like a tidal wave, like the influence from the French discourse. You could see that.
I mean, you're talking about still 2005 or after?
2005. No, this discourse, it's a moment. It's kind of a discursive moment. Now, one of my PhD students, Muriel Pluschke, just submitted her PhD, and she looked at those mechanisms of bottom-up politicization. She looked at local newspapers. She has collected a massive empirical material. She did interviews, by the way. She did interviews with local journalists. She did not only content analysis, but she did interviews with local journalists. And I can say that, unfortunately, it confirms my thesis that you need an occasion to debate that, because you didn't find much of what I have been describing for this debate. So I think that this Europeanization of national public spheres, it needs an occasion. And this constitutional debate was an occasion. It was kind of an exceptional moment. And in everyday life, this is what the findings of Muriel confirm. It doesn't really happen. Now, the question really is whether this is sort of really a problem. Because if we think about national public spaces, they are not there's Habermas somewhere. Yeah? They are not what Habermas's ideal of a deliberative public space is. So where's the public space today? People are on Telegram, people are on X, people are on Instagram, people are on, and then there are people who just read the newspaper, and there are people who just watch classical TV news. So there is, I think I'm tempted to say there is no such thing as a classical public sphere anymore. And I really wonder if this fragmentation then sort of means something critical for the EU or not. But those are points that I wouldn't have answers to. The only thing I can say is that if we think about the European Union conceptually, we should not be, don't use the national frames of thinking. This methodological nationalism, it really doesn't work. if you want to think about the EU, think of it as a multi-level polity. So you have the 27 member states, and then you have the EU somehow above it and interacting with the member states. And then you see that the direct import of concepts from the nation states doesn't work. Then on Roman, I think it's more that I would like to say that there's a lot to think about in that, and I will include this in my conceptual reflections. Whether there's a hierarchy, I'm tempted to say yes. I'm tempted to say that intuitively you are probably right that EU identity is sort of a combination of the three. But I really didn't think this through. It sounded immediately convincing to me. And the second question is more, or the second point is more complicated. The EU mechanisms stopping democratic backsliding in the member states, because empirical evidence tells us that it can do so only to a very limited extent. So the EU has been going on against Hungary time and again and again and again, and look at what happens in Hungary. It didn't really help. I recently was on a podium with Armin von Bogdandy and Christian Jürges discussing their latest books. And Armin von Bogdandy has a very positive vision. So for Armin von Bogdandy, the judges of the Court of Justice of the European Union are the saviors of democracy. They are really knights on horses, riding to defend democracy. And I don't think this is it, because this is really elitist. It's really top down. What I said in December, when Stefan contradicted me violently, is that so I said the Hungarian population elected Orban with a 2/3 majority. And then Stephen said, yes, but the constituencies were sort of cut as to fit with Fidesz, etc., etc. So, and I grant that, yes, of course, okay, so maybe it's not 66% of the Hungarian population behind Fidesz, but it's still a considerable part of the Hungarian population behind Fidesz. And maybe it wouldn't have been a 2/3 majority. But I'm pretty sure that in the last election, it would have been a majority. So you have a majority in a country that voted. I mean, look at the US once more. So he won the elections fair and square, Donald Trump, by a narrow margin, but he won. So he got elected. So apparently the majority of the Americans elected him for doing what he does in the moment. And that's a problem. Now imagine like a fictive world court that would then intervene in the US and say, no, you must not do this. Well, what they would say is, but we elected this guy in order to destroy our democracy. And the thing is that when you become a member of the European Union, that you subscribe to the EU right to intervene in your country, and that's the difference. Mm-hmm. In this workshop where I met Patrick Deneen, which was on Cold War liberalism, one of Patrick Deneen's younger colleagues then came and sort of said, but you're being extremely unfair. The people just want to join a common market, and then you intervene into their political systems. Only a US American can have such a view on the European Union. And I said, listen, no, they don't just join a common market. They subscribe to a club and they sign the EU's right to intervene in their countries. And they, by the way, signed the Copenhagen criteria. They said, yeah. But they weren't interested in democracy. They just wanted the common market. And that might be true, but you sign a treaty. You sign the constitutional court's right. And that's really kind of a tension. And I don't think that there is like an easy solution for that. Mm-hmm. Because you can go enforcing the law. Well, if you have 50% or maybe only 40% of the Hungarian population saying, no, we don't want any of this EU, what do you do? Mm-hmm. Though unfortunately, and that's my answer to the last question, potentiality for more organizations like the EU. I have been working on another article that is in the final stages of review in the moment, that is on the end of the liberal international order and ideological alignments. And unfortunately, the other organization that is like the EU is the United Nations, and they originated sort of at the same time. I think they shared many beliefs, namely in the rule of law and something like a liberal order, and maybe not human dignity. But many of those values of Article 2 of the EU Treaty are values of the UN. So see what happens in the world. I don't think the conjuncture is very much in their favor in the moment. So I would not say there's no potentiality, but this morning we were discussing the thing. So this is what I said this morning, and I think most of you were present this morning in the class. I think, but that is again my conviction, that the core of the brand of the EU is those values. It's democracy, it's Article 2, it's human rights, etc. And I think that in the end, that's a very attractive model of something that might work. I said this morning that I don't think war is a brilliant idea. War is a totally stupid thing to have. It's expensive. It kills people. It destroys countries. I mean, Frankfurt, where I live, was just flat. It was in ruins. It was a beautiful medieval German city. Now it's well, we have skyscrapers. Okay. So what is the interest in having wars? There's sort of no rational interest in having wars. The unfortunate thing is that human beings tend not to be rational always. So I really can't say. Yeah, I really can't say, but the potentiality for institutions like the EU is in people seeing that at least war is not a nice idea.
On this rational point, please join me in thanking Professor Wiesner for. Thank you, Jan, and thank you, Miriam, so much for preparing the commentary.
A pleasure.
Oh. Okay, now I've done some serious work today. And I deserve my dinner.
Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Yeah, as I said, I really use this book in my class and for my students. They want to write a master's thesis on